just received message from Councilman Schmidt. There was a situation in his employment that has him delayed for a few minutes. I'm gonna give him 5 more minutes, if that's okay with everybody, and then we'll go ahead and start the meeting.
It's your call. I mean, it's kind of so last minute thing.
How many organizations do we have here represented?
Well, probably 20. I mean, probably everybody that gets funded.
And that means that, and I didn't make any calls, that means the ones that Corey has recommended not be contracted services don't know it.
We'll deal with that anyway, but I mean, they don't know it.
Well, we have 5 minutes, so.
I see Jack here, he would be happy to sing and dance, I'm sure.
You can hear me. Terry's also here. Jack, are you gonna sing? Talking about Jack or John?
John, he answers to either.
We have 5 minutes. Would you like to dance? Would you like to dance? It's good to see Marilyn.
Mm-hmm. Hi, Terry. For instance, Corey I'm trying to get the cut to convert 3 of our 6 contracted agencies to competitive. And they don't know it, I guess. I have feelings about that, and we'll talk about it, but I'm sure we will. And were you involved in that?
Oh, that would be timeline? Application timeline?
I put it on. It's a little springy for today. I thought, well, you must need it, girl.
Yeah, that's the thing I have my polka dots.
I mean, I, as well as everybody else, when it gets that cold, we all just sort of bundle up in these sort of dawn-colored, thick sweaters and soft boots.
This is just in case we need
Absolutely.
Right. Oh, also, I don't know if you caught it, but, I mean, I can bring it up, but I can tell you, we didn't do the recommended amounts. We have to vote on that. Well, we've presented the recommended forward, so the council has to consider it before the end of January.
The total.
Totals. And it's unclear to me, you know, she's got this thing on there on the agency list that I guess the chief talked about, and this is smooth and juvenile intake. I don't know anything about it, we got given a ratio, and there's no, it's not clear whether he's moving 64,000 bucks over as well. Were you involved in it?
I was not involved in that.
She mentioned to me when I was out the house, that the chief had said something. We don't have any information.
My recommendation is that
Well, that was funded, or that was in our budget, because we threw extra in because of the,
let's leave it as the amount funded.
as the amount funded, which would include the extra.
Correct. Which is $700-something thousand.
Do we have those numbers?
I apologize.
No, no worries. We excused you already, and we stated that we were gonna wait for you to get here.
All right. Thank you.
And Jack wouldn't dance, so we're all just chatting.
I apologize to everybody. It seems like crises always come up at 2:30 on a Friday at work.
We had our IT system go down too. All right. It is 3:09 and we're calling this meeting to order. First item on the agenda is approval of the minutes of December 19, 2014.
do some introductions like a TV.
Could we do that after the approval of the minutes?
Move to approve.
Do I have a second?
Second?
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, same sign. Motion passes. Before we go any further, if we could have some introductions, Mr. Schmidt, could we start with you?
I am Nathan Schmidt, councilman for District 8.
Michelle de la Isla, District 5.
Karen Hiller, District 1.
Corey Wright, Division Director for Housing and Community Development.
Michelle Vega Rotana, with the City of Topeka Housing and Neighborhood Development.
All right. And all of our social service organizations. Okay, third item on the agenda would be the review of the social service funding priorities. In addition to that, I've been notified by Councilwoman Hiller that there may be an amendment to the agenda. Ms. Hiller?
Well, I think we need to add an item C under number 3. We worked through the priorities worksheet last time, but and we have item A and B. A third item is that we need to recommend the amounts of funding forward. The last item at the bottom of that worksheet is how much we're recommending for contract services and how much for other categories.
And just so that everybody is clear, this line that's been added to the agenda does not stipulate the amount that individual organizations would be receiving. It is just a total sum that this committee will then recommend to City Council.
Correct.
Is that in the form of a motion?
If it needs to be, a move to add an item 3C for recommended amounts of funding to the agenda.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Okay, so the first item, item A, is confirm, add, or delete contracted services. Could staff give us a presentation of the contracted services that we have to date?
Sure. Currently, we have Community Resources Council, Jayhawk Area on Agency, Prevention and Recovery Service, Safe Streets, Keep America Beautiful, YWCA Center for Safety and Empowerment, Housing and Credit Counseling.
Discussion with regards to these organizations?
I'm prepared to discuss that, but we did get in our packet some recommendations from staff, so I don't know if you.
Would staff like to proceed with those recommendations and comments?
Sure. H&D feels the following agencies, along with their allocations, should be moved to social services and not held under contracted services. These services provided in the following programs are important to our community, but all provide either emergency aid or counseling and prevention services. And those agencies are Jayhawk Area on Agency, YWCA Center for Safety and Empowerment, and Housing and Credit Counseling. Additionally, H&D feels the following agencies should remain under contracted services since they provide a needed service which the city would have to hire someone to fulfill the duties. Community Resources Council, Prevention and Recovery, Safe Streets, and Keep America Beautiful. Additionally, H&D feels the KCSL juvenile intake program should be moved to contractual services for 2016. Currently, it is a $64,000 grant ran out of the police department, and the police department is agreeable with this change. With these changes, H&D does not feel the contractual service agencies should have to go through the RFP process, but would have to continue to quarterly be monitored and reimbursements monitored by our department.
Discussion from the committee members. Ms. Hiller.
I'm happy to start. I really appreciate it. I think it's always good to review and get input. Just off the bat, I don't agree with the staff's recommendations, but I think it's good for us to discuss them. I went back to the first functioning page, I think it's page 1 of the RFP, which identifies the now 6 agencies and what program and activity that they cover. I do think that staff is correct in their comment in the middle of the page of recommendations that says a service. We looked at when the city originally set up the contracted services agencies that had to do with agencies that were the only ones providing a certain service and for whom the city would want to do that
regardless. So the issue was whether the city would do that service directly or whether they would contract it out to a certain agency, but that it was an essential service. In the case of Jayhawk Area Agency on Aging, the money that we give JAAA at this point is part of their core money that they use to then leverage their grant. So it's not a direct service allocation, it is core money for their, what is it, Department on Aging, or whatever the Older Americans Act grant that then gets dispersed out for the various transportation and meals programs and so on. And that's why, in my understanding, why it got on that list in the first place. With the YWCA, the Center for Safety and Empowerment, they are tied in with the police department's function. They're working on an immediate basis with the police department when there's a battering situation. If that has changed and it's non-essential, then we need to hear about that, and that's why we review these, but I'm not aware that it has. In the case of housing and credit counseling, that is the tenant landlord counseling function, which, especially now that we don't have the Human Relations Commission, is the only fair housing function that we have. And the city is not doing that directly. HCCI got in this list even when we still had the Human Relations Commission, because the fair housing elements of the landlord-tenant situation are so strong, and that was something we felt we wanted to do in the city. Again, if we discuss that and we feel that that's changed, that's what this review is for, and I'm fine with having that conversation. Staff is recommending that CRC, PARS, and Keep America Beautiful stay in this list, but is suggesting that they not have to go through the RFP process. When we set up this program, the idea was that absolutely all of the contracted service agencies should go annually through the RFP process, because it was just as important to see that they were fulfilling their duties and that they were meeting the criteria of being cost effective and so on, and also to put it out there so that if by chance someone else in the community felt that they could provide that contracted services as well or better than that sole organization that had been doing it for years, it left that process open, so it provided that mirror and that challenge to each of the contracted agencies to defend what they were doing and to meet those same standards that everybody else did in terms of performance and so on, but would leave it open for someone else. I also think that at this point it gives us a chance. Both CRC and Safe Streets are changing somewhat internally in what they're doing. There's a vitality nonetheless in that community planning and intervention. Safe Streets has new staff. There's been a shift at the police department. That RFP process gives a chance for them to stay fresh with that and to keep it clear to us and then on to the city council what they're doing and how that's working. Keep America Beautiful as well. It gives them a chance to put that information out there, and I personally think that's important. In terms of the suggestion that we take over juvenile intake, I don't have any material about that at all, and so I don't, again, that's certainly obviously tied to the police department, but do we have any more information? And with this $64,000, was the police department planning to put another $64,000 in the pot?
The idea behind that would be to kind of centralize the grants that the city is receiving. It is a contractual service that the city is receiving. The $64,000 would be transferred from the police budget to this contractual service budget.
Okay. And I'm just curious, did this come from the police department or come from staff?
This came from a coordination of finance, police, and our staff.
Okay. Well, I could be comfortable with that then. It'll be good to read through it. I would not think they should be out of the RFP process either. That was part of why we did this, was so they all did do that and didn't just go year after year. So, Madam Chair, that would be my position on this.
At this point, I would like to provide staff the opportunity to just give some explanation on why the specific organizations then were recommended, so that to address some of Ms. Hiller's concerns.
Sure. first, I wanted to reiterate that the reporting of the outcomes and outputs and the quarterly reporting, the reimbursements, the financials would all be still tracked. So the minus the actual doing the application itself, we would still be tracking all the information that you're talking about. But these were services that were being provided to the city that if they weren't provided, the city would have to provide them in essence, which is hence contractual services. These other agencies, yes, they do work with the departments, but we felt that they were, like CASA, for example, also works with the police department. I mean, many of the agencies down here work with the city in other departments, but they still are fitting in that social service category, which is kind of where we were trying to get everybody in the right spot for that. Keep America Beautiful is also one that does great things for the community, but it wouldn't fit in the social service category because it wouldn't be one of your priorities, so we left that in contractual services.
That's a good point.
Mr. Schmidt, do you have comments with regards to this?
No, well, I would ask Councilwoman Hiller what are your specific issues with the recommendations from staff? I mean, the point-by-point issues that you don't agree with?
In summary, I would leave all 6 of the existing agencies as contracted service agencies, add the juvenile intake program from KCSL, and have them all go through the RFP process
So your
annually.
objection is to eliminating the RFP process?
It would be, the staff suggestion was to take 3 that are currently contract services and move them into the other competitive section. I wouldn't do that, but we can continue talking about it. One of the reasons we set up this social service process was so that an agency didn't get into a routine where there was no RFP, no annual review at the staff. Often it was even at the staff level, much less the council level, of what they were doing and what their numbers were. And the RFP process got it into a routine where there was oversight and transparency about what we were doing. And therefore, if there were changes in focus or whatever, that would be pushed out through that RFP process as well.
My concern is that I do understand, for example, the essential service that the city used to provide. That, for example, the YWCA, the police department, does not have a department that specializes just on batteries.
Right.
So therefore, YWCA CSE is directly working with, battered services that otherwise, we do have our officers that are very well trained on how to handle the situation.
Right.
However, there is not a division that works on the post-care.
Correct.
Therefore, that I understand. My only concern is that when we talk about housing and credit counseling, I don't want the public to get confused because what the HRC used to do is extremely different than what HCCI does.
Absolutely.
HRC, when they were active, they were able to go, and when a claim was made, they were able to go into the residence in question and work as investigators. Housing and credit counseling does not leave the office. They are not your investigator. They are there to provide advice with regards to issues of tenant and landlords. But they're not doing the function of fair housing. So I don't want that to get confused in the verbiage.
But it was funded as a fair housing is an element of what they do, and the tenant landlord is big and is critical to people's lives, and it disproportionately affects minorities. So.
Does the committee feel like they would like to make a motion with regards to the recommendations of staff at this point in time with regards to the contracted services? Does anybody feel that some of them may stay, or should we leave them as a recommendation of Councilwoman Hiller did? Mr. Schmidt, do you have any additional comments?
Not right now. Give me a minute here. So I guess what we're looking for is approval of, what you're recommending is approval of the status quo.
Plus the juvenile
Plus-
intake.
Plus the juvenile
Yes, and
intake.
I'd be happy to make that as a motion if that helps to move it along. Still be changed. And I am open, I mean.
Well, I guess I'd like to hear from staff. What kind of burden that would place on you in comparison to the recommendations?
It would just be continue as we are at the current moment. The reasoning behind the switch was simply to put the same people competing, or the same type of service competing for the same type of money. So even though we're moving people from contractual services, we would also move that allocation to social services. So it's really a matter of stating whether they're contracted services or social services, but they're competing in the pot with people with like services. So that was the mentality behind that. There are certain contractual services, CRC for example, significantly different than our social service sides. But you know, the YWCA does great things, but it's more in the social service side in our feelings. So we were just trying to get it all kind of equaled out into the right spots.
I'm having to refresh too. Years ago, I mean, one of the reasons Housing and Credit Counseling's tenant landlord program got started was that it was an alternative to having a consumer protection division in the city attorney's office or the attorney general's office and so on. And so at this point, we don't have consumer protection attorneys doing that kind of work at city attorney or the DA's office or the AG's office. So that was thinking back.
I understand that, Ms. Hiller. The only thing that I will say is that we should be very cautious on our deep understanding of certain programs so
Understood.
that we don't show like we're having preference towards them.
But been around for 40 years on all of these, except if they aren't that old.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So at this point, I'll just ask, is there a motion?
Well, I'll move to retain the 6 that we've had in the past and add the juvenile intake program with an understanding that an additional $64,000 would come into the Youth and Social Services fund from the police department. I don't think it would require any other changes because right now everybody goes through the RFP. So.
I can second that.
You can second that. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, same sign. Motion passes. Second item on the agenda would be to confirm the minimum and the maximum amount of funding. For those of you that are watching, last time that we had our meeting, there was discussion with regards to $10,000 being the floor, or whether we should change that floor in case there was a percentage, somebody applied for $10,000 and the percentage was not right, and even though they had a great grant, the funding wasn't there. So at this point in time, the committee haven't had a chance to think about this. Mr. Schmidt, you spearheaded the conversation here. Do you have any further comments on this?
Well, my comment was, or my recommendation, if I recall correctly, was simply to, instead of setting the maximum and minimum amounts of funding, setting the maximum and minimum amounts of request at $10,000, so that we wouldn't be forcing people to inflate numbers just for the sake of applying. And I would be happy to support that again.
Ms. Hiller, do you have discussion?
Well, we talked about a variety of things, actually, so that's where you ended up with it.
Mhm.
I like that better than some of the things we talked about.
So at this point, Mr. Schmidt, would you like to make a motion?
I would move that we set the minimum and maximum amount of requested funding at $10,000. Not, let me rephrase that.
Okay.
A lot of people nervous here.
There were maybe some,
We had no cap last time.
We had no
just as a
cap.
clue.
correct. Exactly. I make a motion, I withdraw that motion. I make a motion that we set the minimum amount of requested funding at $10,000.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
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 All opposed, same sign. Motion passes.
And the maximum? We need to do that too.
Well, I guess I would make a motion that we not establish a maximum.
Second.
Okay.
What?
All, discussion? I think that one of the things that we struggled with last year when we were talking about maximums, even though we never put a number, was the fact that we never wanted to be the 100% provider of any program. And there was a lot of conversation with regards to that. The committee was very passionate, and we had long discussion with regards to, let's say that the city does not fund a certain amount for the program, that the city was not going to be wholly responsible for shutting that program down because that funding was simply not available. And I think that we had the discussion, but we never came to grips with, establishing a percentage that we'd be willing to support. And I think that before we go ahead and move forward with such a motion, I would remind the committee that this was something that, at that point in time, I don't know how everybody feels right now, people were extremely concerned that they did not want to be the make it or break it for any organization. And we talked about maybe having a cap of not being more than 50% of an organization's budget, or even 40% of an organization's full budget. But if the committee still chooses that there is no friendly amendment that they would like to make to this motion, and they would like to continue with no maximum amount, the time to do it is now. However, if there is still strong feeling that the city does not want to be solely responsible for running a program outside of the city, the time to discuss it as well as now.
Well, my feeling on that is that I don't want to set a maximum or a limit on what percentage of a budget we are of a particular program. I think that establishing the process that we've established and doing all of the hours and hours of work that staff has put in and that this committee has put in, along with the social services groups, I think we've done a good job of making sure that we have quality programs that are getting quality outcomes and doing quality things in the community. And I think I don't want to get into micromanaging how they budget their process. If that means that in a year or 5 years or whenever, and we have a budget crunch and it eliminates, I think that's the responsibility of the organization to prepare for that. and not the responsibility of this committee. So I would not support formatting it that way.
Ms. Hiller, do you have comments?
Well, that's really good discussion. It may be that, for this year again, I mean, if there's something the city is a contracted service, however that turns out to be, that they want to pay for, and it's less expensive than having city staff do it, maybe we just do that. On the other hand, when we get to the score sheet, one of the things that's in the amended version is we struggled with a variety of things last year when it got down to it. I worked with Corey. With your support, there will be a sort of a disclaimer at the end of the score sheet that would allow this committee to choose not to recommend any agency or program or a new program, or to fund a program with a proviso. So that if the math works out in a way that we're not comfortable with, or if this committee looks at it and says, you know, this is new or it's old or whatever it is, but we're not comfortable funding 100% of it, we want to see some other funding in this before it comes back. We would have the ability to do that with an amendment to the score sheet this time. So, as a possibility of how to deal with your concern, because it could be the 100% funding, it could be something else. That was a concern of the committee.
And I think that's fine. I think that's off topic of the motion that's on the table right now. But yeah, I think it's important to recognize that portion of the discussion is upcoming. But yes,
Well, I just meant if 100% funding was one of the concerns.
we can always
we could address it.
individually address that.
Yes, that was
Okay.
my point.
Any other discussion? Okay, well, those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, same sign. Motion passes. So we have maximums and minimums, and now we are going into a 2016 application timeline.
No.
Nope.
Item C?
Oh, the funding recommendation, pardon me. This was an amended item to the agenda, and it is just to determine what the funding amounts are gonna be for the specific categories. At this point in time, staff, could you give us a recap of what were the 2014 recommended amounts in total?
Sure. The contracted service was 225,000, and social services ended up at 349,946.
And this was prior to amendments?
This was with the additional 77,946 that
With the additional?
council, yes.
Okay. So that means that in order for this year's contracted numbers to work, we would have to add an additional $64,000 to that amount that would be coming from the TPD?
Yes.
Madam Chair?
Yes, ma'am.
I brought along my sheet from last year, and when we approved this last year, it was 225,000 and 407,000, I think. I want to make sure we've got our numbers. And I did not bring this stuff from when the council added money. I don't think I have it.
Nikki's looking for the numbers. If you just allow us a minute,
Okay.
Yeah, we're gonna
Finance
double check
Department
those
is gonna help
numbers.
us
Okay, good.
figure out these numbers.
Sure can't tell all these things.
225 sounds correct.
It looks like that's across the board, and then I can't remember whether we added money.
Not
at
for
both
method
levels.
services, it was for social
Okay,
services
it
that
was all
numbers were
below.
added.
Okay, so one correction, the, juvenile intake was 60,000, not 64. I got those
60,000?
two programs switched around, so.
Okay.
So that would be 60,000 coming from the police department.
Okay.
The total on contracted services was in fact 225,000, so we would add the 60,000 to that, if that's what you
285.
wish.
I'm sorry, what, could you repeat the figure?
225,000 was contracted services.
Uh-huh. Plus the 60.
And then general fund monies, we had 349,946. What is the CDBG?
And the CDBG funding?
134,999. Okay. Yeah, so this was what was allocated by council, not just necessarily the ECD committee last year.
Okay.
Mhm. Thank you.
So committee, at this point in time, for contracted services, with $60,000 coming from the Topeka Police Department, it would add up to $285,000 for contracted services. Then, in addition, you would have, based on the allocations with the changes that were added from council last year, there were 349,946 that came from the general fund. And finally, CDBG was 134,999.
Which comes to a total of 484,945 by my math.
For both CDBG and general fund,
Correct.
correct?
That works with that 407,000
Okay,
figure.
so it's
That's better.
484?
484,945 is
So should we say 485?
by my math.
I would say yes. Is that in the form of a motion, Ms. Hiller?
Sure. Would move that contracted city services be 285,000. Other categories be 485,000.
Do we have a second? Or do you have any changes, Mr. Schmidt?
Well, I think we're discussing keeping status quo with no increase in funding for this year as the recommendation of this committee,
I think that.
based on that proposal.
Yes and no, because last year, there was additional funding added, $77,000 in additional funding that was added at the end, that the expectation would be that this year, the allocations would be final. So in turn, considering the amount that was approved last year, there was an increase. And what we will be doing is just adopting that change to add as additional funding for the organizations that qualify. Do you have any?
Given that, and because we didn't think we were allocating that much last year, and we don't have a second on my motion yet, would it balance better, and I'm not doing math here, but to shift, to put some additional funding into the contracted services and put them up to, let's say, 300,000. We had 70,000 that we didn't expect we were gonna allocate last year, but the council added, correct?
Correct.
Correct?
Correct.
Roughly 70, 75.
That
So,
was,
and
I
where
think
you-
it was 78, I think. It was
Okay.
my motion that added it.
Okay.
But, yeah, which it was the math that we did during the actual budget
So-
hearings. And I'm trying to calculate, I'm trying to remember, last year, this committee recommended a 5% increase over
The year before.
the year before.
Okay,
And then that increase was supplemented by the 77 or 78,000 roughly that we added during budget negotiations, which
Correct.
would be, and that was entirely on the social services portion of it.
that's right.
So we had, I'm not positive what that would be, but that is a significant increase.
The
Of-
only thing that I would cautiously add is, I don't want to be Debbie Downer here, but I want to remind everybody here that we are facing significant challenges at the state level.
Mhm.
And all of those challenges at the state level will more than likely have an impact on our general fund. And I want to make sure that as we're making these policy decisions today, that we take into account that we may be projecting and proposing to the council body a significant amount of money. But in turn, we may end up having to adjust these numbers significantly depending on what the budget looks like. So us talking about increases, I want to just caution us that not only increases, but even maintaining what we had this year, we don't know what's going to happen, because we don't know what's going to happen with the general fund. Not that our general fund is in a bad place, you know, we're doing pretty well there, but we don't know what impact the changes at the state are going to have on our budget.
I agree completely. I'm thinking out loud here. I'm not trying to make any recommendations. I'm trying to calculate it. Essentially, we had over a 20% increase in funding last year that was approved by the council. And you're 100% right. We don't know what the impact of the state budget situation is going to be, other than that it's likely not going to be positive. We're also making a recommendation here. This is non-binding and will be able to be adjusted ultimately by the budget committee before. So I would be happy with recommending maintaining the status quo, which I had as 280, well, the status quo plus the $60,000 from the police department, which I had as 285,000 for contractual services and 485,000 for social services. And if those were the numbers that you had in your motion, then I would be willing to second that motion, but is that the numbers that you said?
I think so, but can we talk about it for another minute? Based on what you were talking about in terms of going back to the numbers that we had last year, which were a 5% increase over the year before, another way to look at that would be to go back to what we recommended last year. If we thought that 5% would be good again, let's just say, that would push the 285,000 up by $15,000 to 300,000. That would provide a 5% increase for those. Wait a minute. I did that on 285 instead of 225, so that's a little off. I'm just thinking,
12,500.
I'll go back and fix that. Corresponding, if we left the total the same and left the difference below, it would still be a 13% increase over what we had expected to allocate last year. And with this adjustment, it'll probably be about 15%. So we could go back to last year's numbers to do the spread between the two if we chose.
So bottom line, what you're recommending would be 300,000 for contractual services.
What she's recommending is, if I may preface,
Please.
adjusting, going back, eliminate the $78,000 that were added, and then just say 5% over the original 225 that was offered for contractual services, and 5% above what was originally offered to social service organizations without that 77,000. And that would balance us to 5% up. But then instead of just social services receiving an increase, she's suggesting that also contracted services receive an increase as well. rather than just allocating a 15 to 20% solely to one group. Am I correct, Ms. Hiller?
Close. If we were gonna leave the total the same and make sure that there was a 5% increase at the contracted services level, there would still be about a 13% increase over what we had budgeted last year for the other categories.
Could you just give us the figures that you were thinking of?
Now, I redid it on the 5% on 225,000, and it came up to 236, 250. So, is that, no? Is it too high?
5% of 225,000 would be 12,500.
12,500.
So it would be 237,500,
All right, well,
I think.
if we just rounded that to 240, that would be the 300,000, actually. It's very close. So that would be a little over 5% for the contracted services, would give us 300,000 in that line item. And,
Oh, with the 60,000.
470,000 in the social services, which would be essentially subtracting the 15,000.
yes, yes.
So the final recommendation would be, with the additional 60,000 from the police department budget, 300,000 for contractual services, 470,000 for social services.
Yes.
That's the motion.
Is that a friendly amendment?
Well,
Well, we haven't seconded, so.
sure, that's the motion.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Okay, all in favor, say aye.
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 All opposed, same sign. So for the record, pardon the confusion and all the math making. For the upcoming grant cycle, $300,000 are being allocated for contracted services. Out of these $300,000, $60,000 or $60,000 are monies from the TPD. And then $470,000 are to be allocated amongst social service organizations. Okay, next item on the agenda is the review of the 2016 application timeline. Would staff like to take the wheel on this one?
Sure. We dispersed that calendar to you. I believe there was a concern with the review. So the request, just for the audience, the request for proposal would go out February 2nd. We would H&D would hold a workshop February 16th to help with that process. Applications would be due March 2nd. We would then let people know if they did not meet minimum standards by March 13th. This is where we might have some changes. Newly appointed ECD committee will review and determine whether there's a need for expert advisors. By April 15th, applications provided to the ECD committee members for scoring. Week of April 27th, presentations by agencies to ECD committee if needed. Week of May 4th, ECD committee will meet for final scoring of applications. June 1st, recommendations for city council, and approximately June 30th, city council adopts city budget. I believe there was a concern with the April 15th deadline with the newly formed ECD committee would not be formed yet. Is that correct?
Yep.
Okay, so we would have to push that back a week or two.
You know, I tried to print out everything I'd sent you, and it looks like I don't have that email, but realistically, the elections are the first week of April. The deputy mayor gets elected the second Tuesday in April. That person then typically the third week in April, then if they do it that fast, gets out a sign-up sheet for everybody on the council to sign up what committee they want to be on. And the council's rules set that those committee assignments should be made by May 1. And I'm not sure with that process that it's going to, just because we'd like to speed this up, I don't know that it can be done any sooner. And so I'm not sure that realistically, the committee could be expected to meet any sooner than the second week of May. I don't think it's unreasonable to expect them to just kick straight in, get a meeting organized and roll if they know that that's what they're doing. But I don't think they can meet any sooner.
Then the second week in May.
Yeah, do you?
I agree.
I mean, with the May 1 organization deadline?
I may not be here, so you two aren't up for.
Now, whatever. But we are trying to plan this generically, whether it's an election year or not. So,
And I tend to agree with Ms. Hiller that if it's being pushed at least to the second week of May,
Okay. So the April 15th date would change to May 11th, which would be the second week in May.
I think they could be provided to the committee on May the 2nd, assuming that the committee has been appointed by May 1. But realistically, to set a meeting and do a public announcement and actually meet and consider those proposals is not likely to happen until the second week in May.
and that's why May 11 would be an okay date. Because
But not for the date to mail them out. I mean, the committee has to be able to look at them before they meet. And they really are supposed to meet, well, maybe, because the way we're set up is that committee would decide whether they want a team of advisors to help them. And they've got to have time to do that.
Well, the April 15th date was when we were going to provide the ECD committee members for scoring, so that would be the date we would need to change to the second week of May, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So then, presentations would be the following week, May 18th. And then final scoring the next week, if we're trying to meet the June 1st deadline.
Corey,
Yes.
in my note to you, when I read this, I thought, okay, she left May 4th to June 1st to allow for that new appeal timeline, which is a 3-week turnaround. So I thought, well, maybe she purposefully didn't put that in the calendar so as not to encourage appeals or whatever your reason was. But realistically, if we need to leave space to do that in this calendar, we can't do it by June 1.
It would
We
be
just can't.
extremely difficult.
But if we could still make recommendations to the council and then handle the appeals
And
afterward.
what I was going to suggest was the
But
big
the idea
important
was to
issue
keep the agencies from the council
is
meeting.
to approve these numbers
Uh-huh.
for the council. And I think that that is the most important part that we as a committee are to provide to city council. City council vote will, the deputy mayor is going to put a committee together that will then be in charge of those allocations. And I'm not saying that it's not gonna be important on who those allocations are going to be received, what organizations are going to receive it. But I think that as long as the committee has been able to provide city council an expectation of what the number is, that is the most important thing that this committee should be focused on. Now, council can and has the power to make different determinations if they are not content with how the allocations were made. But the most important thing, and we will have time at that point, in different meetings, while the budget meetings are occurring, to make changes if needed, just like it happened this last session. However, I don't feel as much pressure if we're not exactly done by the 1st of June, because the most important thing is for us to have the number, the total number that the policymakers are going to adopt as final budget, so that they're able to run with their budget process.
I agree, and that's what I'd communicated to Corey, that if we needed to push it out a little bit, I do think we're okay. The idea of the appeals process was to have it happen in committee, and so we don't want to push that out, I don't think.
So Corey, if you need to move it a little bit further from June 1st, feel free to do so.
Okay.
as long as the final time of appeal does not occur outside of the time of those budget meetings, that the moment that the budget is finally gonna be approved by city council, that's the main concern that we have.
Okay.
We did last year approve this and we submitted this. This goes into the RFP and it does get submitted to council, so we may need to plug some dates in here so that we can approve this today.
And that's what I'm asking
Okay.
Corey to do, just
Okay.
to do that now, so that we
Okay.
could get those dates in there, even if it's not on June 1st ending.
Yeah, yeah.
We have finance working with our staff, trying to figure out what dates those meetings are gonna happen, so that we could get this calendar worked out.
So maybe June, so right here, we could do June 1st, and then,
Because when you go back to that appeals
this
process,
June 1st. we could
they've
do
got
this
10
like
days to do it.
Yeah,
We've got
June
7 days to have a meeting.
15th, last committee.
So it's at least a 3-week
Set for the 23rd.
Mhm.
process to
But then
turn
you
it
have
around.
The right to appeal, and then council's. Okay. A suggestion, if I may. Last year, we did not do presentations by agencies. If we took that out with the right to appeal at this point, I feel like that would kind of be a catch-22 there. That would save us a week where we could push May 18th for the week in replace of May 4th for the ECD committee to do final scoring. Then we can do the recommendations a little quicker, so we're not pushing so much close to the budget.
How does the committee feel
Suggestion.
about this?
Well, I think that sounds entirely reasonable.
Ms. Hiller?
So the suggestion is that we don't have hearings. We just review the applications and discuss them.
Yes, Councilwoman Hiller,
Okay.
if we did instead of April 15th, we replaced that with May 11th, where the
Uh-huh.
applications are provided to the ECD committee. We did May 18th for ECD committee doing final scoring. That would give us ample of time to do an appeal process before June 1st, which is our ultimate goal that we initially had for getting this completed. Then we could still keep our same current deadline and have ample time to. And I'd be happy to put the appeal process on this calendar if you'd like it.
Please do so.
The committee might want to meet more than once. The appeal process really has 3 weeks in it. I would
Does, yeah.
suggest, and I'm not, help me with the math, that a June 10th date might be better than a June 1st date. To just give some room for a committee. What if somebody's on vacation? What if they get sick? I mean, we need to be able to leave enough room in there to,
The appeal process is 2 weeks, so seven days to appeal and then 7 days after to get the response from the
2-week
ECD
process.
committee.
okay.
But we can certainly push that June 1st to June 10th
I
if you
think
prefer.
June 10th gives time for,
Okay,
Mr. Schmidt, do you feel comfortable?
I think it'll be fine for council.
Okay. Ms. Wright, would you mind repeating those dates so that everybody gets a chance to understand the flow, even though they will get this, but for those people watching at home?
sure. So the request for proposal will go out February 2nd. Application workshop by the city will be held February 16th. Applications will be due March 2nd. Proposals that do not meet minimum standards would be notified by March 13th. By May 11th, applications will be provided to the ECD committees for scoring. May 18th, the ECD committee will meet for final scoring of applications. We will add the appeal process in there at a 2-week interval. I need to check the date on that. And then June 10th, recommendations will be ready for city council.
Ms. Hiller?
Got a question here. This, backing up to the RFP date and the workshop date, this proposal, last year there was 6 weeks. It was the middle of February and they were due April 1. This backs it up to only a 4-week window for preparing the applications, and they're due 2 weeks after the training. My question would be, and any answer's okay, is that enough time for the agencies? And was there any discussion or?
Yeah, it looks like there's a week minus in the process. However, I feel like we took, if we continue with our application that it currently exists, we've taken a lot of the application out. So I think it will kind of equal itself out in their ability to finish the application.
Because at this point, and I know you were hammering this thing down, there would be 2 full months between the deadline date and the date that the committee looks at them. So it wouldn't have to go that fast. If that's a good time frame, that's fine. If they should have more time, we'd have time to give it to them in this calendar.
Well, before the ECD committee gets the applications,
You have to
we
work
have
'em.
to review the
Absolutely.
process, and so we'll have to really go through each and every application, so that's definitely gonna take some time. So
Okay.
that's probably why we had some ample time in there for that. So,
Okay. We just added a couple weeks to that, so I
Sure.
just was double checking.
Yep.